Well, hello, and welcome to midway through Advent. You know, there are some things about Advent you may not really be aware of, and it's good to recall some aspects that aren't really always emphasized. For example, Advent is actually the beginning of the church liturgical year. January 1st begins the calendar year, and July 1st is often the beginning of the fiscal year for government and business. But Advent begins the church year. Now, the thing about Advent is it's always been a somewhat confused season. Going way back to pagan times, before Christianity, the pagans used to become very frightened in the autumn because the days became shorter and shorter, the leaves on the trees died, and they began to, pray to their gods, for help because of the fear that was setting in. Death seemed to be all around. And as Christianity came into prominence, the Christians Christianized these notions. And so we founded the Feast of All Saints and All Souls Day at November 1st. And it kind of was that November became a time, if you focus on the readings, November is a time that often speaks of our own personal death, our own getting ready to meet the Lord in our own personal one-on-one between us and God. But then, as time went on, the church continued to kind of segue into December, and a lot of the readings were about not just our personal death, but the end of the world, the end of time, and the final judgment. And we still have that today. One of the interesting things about the church year is that as it closes with our personal death and heaven, hell, and purgatory in November, in Advent, the beginning of the year, we still have these themes of the coming of Christ at the end of time and our being ready for it. Now, the interesting thing is that the church put penitence as a major theme to kind of like a mini Lent, so that we would get ready to purge ourselves of sin and be ready for Christ's return at the end of time. The interesting thing, though, about all of that is Christmas began to become popular. In the early church, Christmas was not a big holiday. Everything revolved around Easter and Holy Week. It wasn't until probably the 5th or 6th century that Christmas began to become popular. And because of that, as we got closer to Christmas, the emphasis went from expecting the coming of Jesus at the end of time to a remembrance of the coming of Jesus on the 25th of December at Christmas time. And so it became less of a penitential season and more of a season that you should wait in joyful hope. In joyful hope. And so we had Gaudete Sunday. And so there was a shift. So they de-emphasized Advent being a mini Lent, and then put an emphasis more on the joyful waiting. And then in very recent years, especially here in the United States, Advent became associated more with Mary and her anxious anticipation and giving birth to Jesus. Again, this notion of the Christ coming among us, and Mary's role in that. And so we have here in the United States, December the 8th, which is a holy day of obligation, but they also, almost within the same week, we have Our Lady of Guadalupe. And one of the interesting things about the Latino and Hispanic cultures is they often say the rosary in May, the month that's often dedicated to Mary, October, the month of the rosary, and they'll say the rosary every day during Advent. And this is again because of Mary's role in the incarnation and being the mother of Jesus. So again, as Christmas once became a more popular feast throughout the church, the shift came in December, around December 17th, midway through Advent, and that's where we are right now. And a popular prayer that a lot of lay people have begun to latch onto is the same that priests, deacons, bishops, and consecrated religious have to pray under obligation every day, is the Liturgy of the Hours. And during these last days of Advent, there's a thing we call the O Antiphons, which are recited at evening prayer every day before we recite the Magnificat. And I like to go through them with you a little bit because we started on the 17th of December with O Sapientia, which means come, wisdom of our God. And then O Adonai, which means come, leader of ancient Israel. And then O Radix Jesse, which means come, flower of Jesse's stem. And Clavis David, which means O come, key of David. And then Orions, which means come, radiant dawn. O Rex Gentium, which means come, king of all nations. And then finally, the one that everybody is most familiar with, O Emmanuel, O come, Emmanuel, which we say on the 23rd. Now, another thing about Advent, did you know, or maybe you didn't know, that the Advent wreath actually originated in Germany among the Lutherans. So it's not a Catholic tradition originally. Back in the 16th century, the Lutheran Church had decided to begin using the Advent wreath to Christianize some pagan practices about the winter solstice that continued even though Christianity was becoming the dominant faith in Europe. There were pagan practices that were still lingering on, and the Lutherans wanted to Christianize these practices. What are those practices? Well, lighting of candles and lighting of certain fires and Yule logs and those sort of things. So they invented the Advent wreath with the candles as a way of Christianizing some of these practices. And of course, it caught on in other Germanic countries and eventually spread throughout Europe. And then the Europeans, particularly the Germans, brought it here to the United States. And so we have the Advent wreaths. Now here's a tidbit for you. The Advent wreath actually is supposed to do that at home. There's a little thing that I kind of talk about, and I kind of nudge the priests about this. I says, it's real nice that we have the Advent wreath in church, and we do this every Sunday. But you really want to do it upright, you should have your Advent wreath at home with the candles. And if you have kids, they'll love it, because they love to blow out the candles. They love to light candles. It's like a birthday thing to them, you know, and it catches on. How about the Jesse tree? Biblical persons have been associated with the gradual coming of the Messiah. And so the Jesse tree is named after the father of David. Now the symbols of the tree are added to represent the ancestors of Jesus, either in faith or in bloodline, such as Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesse, David, Solomon, Joseph, and Mary. And then another variation of the Jesse tree is a popular variation called the Christmas house, or sometimes it's called the Advent house. And it's one where you have a little house with many windows which are opened each day to display the coming of Jesus. So finally on December 24th, the last door is open and you have a little nativity scene in there. This is another one that's great for kids if you want to do something at home to get them ready for the coming of Christmas, the real coming of Christmas, the nativity with Jesus. Now another tradition which combines the spirit of conversion and the coming of Jesus is having children prepare the manger for the nativity scene. This is particularly popular among the Latino and Hispanic people. And each night, children are invited to place in the manger one piece of straw for each good deed that they've done that day. So you might want to try that one out. And finally, let's talk about the Advent colors. The traditional Advent color is purple or violet. And these colors represent the penitential spirit that I talked about that was associated with the season. But liturgists and other church leaders have begun to clarify this theme of Advent for us today, emphasizing its own distinct theme, and that it's not just a little Lent. So today you'll often find the colors that are more bright. They're brighter and not the kind that are associated with Lent. So you'll notice the priest's vestments during Advent are a little bit different color than they are in Lent. They have a little more bluish tint to them than the violet in Lent. That's it. I told you about Advent and some of the things you may not have been aware of. And my next video, you might want to get yourselves ready for this. When is a Christmas carol not a Christmas carol? Think about it. I'll get back to you on that.
All right.